Yeah. For those of you that want to know what we're all about.
Welcome to Clout 941. I'm Ron Filipkowski, your host. Visit our website at www.clout941.com. This is the only live television show on Sarasota politics and issues, and we have one of the best guests we've ever had on our show tonight. We are so excited to welcome the president of the National Black Republican Association, Frances Rice. Frances, thank you for coming on our show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Well, we're going to learn a lot tonight. This is going to be very educational. I've heard you speak a number of times, but I know a lot of people haven't, and this is a chance for us to get some information out that maybe people aren't aware of. First of all, let me ask you this. A lot of people become either Republican or Democrat because that's what their parents were. They grow up, you know, and they're indoctrinated a certain way, and other people kind of come to it on their own. How did you come to be a Republican?
I've been a Republican for as long as I have been politically aware. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia in the early 1940s at Grady Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born. And from time to time I attended Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor.
Right.
And we participated in civil rights protests because it was the Democrats that we were fighting. So we understood that it was the Democrats who was denying blacks our civil rights. And so I've been a Republican for as long as I can remember.
Long time. It wasn't something that just happened recently.
Absolutely not.
Tell us about your background, though, aside from politics. What did you do for a career?
Well, I started off working in the military. I spent 20 years in the Army. I retired as a lieutenant colonel. And after I retired, I did some legal work with the McDonnell Douglas Corporation in their think tank, and as a government contract lawyer. I also taught business law for the University of Maryland in the overseas division. And when my husband retired from the Foreign Service, we settled down here in Sarasota.
Well, you got quite a diverse background. You got a lot of different things covered there. Let me ask you this. It's pretty obvious that, you know, in this country, 90 to 95% or so of African Americans identify themselves with the Democratic Party, even though that was, like you said, during the 60s, and they were essentially Jim Crow party back then in the South. Why do you think that is?
Why so many black Americans are voting for Democrats today?
That's right.
It's because most blacks do not know that it was the Republican Party that fought to free blacks from slavery. The Civil War was indeed a war between the North and the South, but it was also a war between the Republicans and Democrats, and thank God the Republicans won. And after the Republicans freed blacks from slavery, they amended the Constitution to grant blacks freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then they passed the civil rights laws of the 1800s to make sure that the newly freed slave could exercise their constitutional rights. And if the Democrats had left blacks alone at that time, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But the Democrats set out for themselves, sorry to continue, set out for themselves the horrendous task of keeping blacks in virtual slavery. They started the Ku Klux Klan to lynch and terrorize Republicans, black and white. They also overturned those civil rights laws of the 1800s when they took over Congress in 1892 with the 1894 Civil Rights Repeal Act. The Democrats also started those Jim Crow laws and those black codes in order to make sure that blacks could not exercise their rights. And it took Republicans nearly 6 decades to finally get some civil rights laws in the 1950s and the 1960s passed. And it was the Democrats that the Republicans were fighting, and it was Democrat Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois who pushed through the 1950, the 1960, the 1964, the 1965, and 1968 civil rights laws.
That's the next thing I was going to ask you about, because I hear from a lot of Democrats who do profess to, you know, study history, and they point to the '64 Civil Rights Act and they say, well, you know, this was a John Kennedy thing, and the Democrats were the ones behind the '64 Civil Rights Act, and the Republicans opposed it. And I think a lot of them point to Barry Goldwater, I guess, who had opposed it on because he thought it was unconstitutional on states' rights grounds. But is that history right? Is it that the Democrats were in favor of the '64 civil rights and the Republicans opposed it?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, in his book, Unfounded Loyalty, Inner City Minister Reverend Wayne Perriman tells the truth about the history of civil rights. He was a Democrat, and he did a year-long research and uncovered the true history of civil rights. And John F. Kennedy was not a civil rights advocate. In fact, he voted against the 1957 civil rights law that was pushed through under President Eisenhower, a Republican. John F. Kennedy had Dr. King investigated on suspicion of being a communist in order to undermine Dr. King. John F. Kennedy was opposed to the 1963 March on Washington by Dr. King. Had it not been for the Republicans, the 1964 civil rights law would not have been passed because it was the Democrats who were filibustering it, including Robert Byrd, who is still in the Congress and was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. It was, as I said, Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen, a Republican, who pushed through that civil rights law. Lyndon Johnson would not have gotten that law passed had it not been for the Republicans. Johnson himself was not a civil rights advocate. In his 4,500-word State of the Union address in 1965, he only mentioned 35 words about civil rights and not one word about voting rights. It was the Democrats who filibustered the civil rights laws of the 1950s and the 1960s, and it was Republicans who pushed it through.
But you know, the other thing that you hear from Democrats, though, is that Lyndon Johnson started the Great Society programs, and all of these programs helped black Americans so much, and that's another reason why they identify with the Democratic Party. What do you think about that?
That's absolutely not true. The so-called war on poverty is what got blacks hooked on government handout programs, and these inner cities that have been run by Democrats for the past 40 years have been turned into economic and social wastelands. And people like to trash Barry Goldwater, but Barry Goldwater was not against civil rights. In fact, while he was in Arizona, he helped start the NAACP, and he voted for all the civil rights laws. He just had one objection to one part of the 1964 civil rights law because he thought it was at that point an unconstitutional expansion of federal power. So he was not against civil rights as opposed to Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy.
Now, you started the National Black Republican Association. Why did you start it, and what is the mission of it?
Well, we were 5 of us here in Florida, black Republicans, who decided to stop complaining and start doing, because we're hearing all this misinformation about the history of civil rights. So we decided to start the National Black Republican Association to recapture the rich civil rights legacy of the Republican Party and expose the racist past and failed socialism of the Democratic Party. And as author Michael Shore stated, the Democratic Party is the party of the 4 S's: slavery, secession, segregation, and now socialism.
Oh, okay, I saw that on your website. That's provocative. We're going to talk about some more things that you stand for and you've spoken about in the past. When we come back from our break, we'll have more with Francis Rice.